All right, so New York City's new mayor, Eric Adams, the former police officer who's literally only been in office for a couple of weeks, is already off to an absolutely horrendous start. Now, I could count on my hand at least 5 things that he's done in his first 2 weeks that would warrant assuming that he's going to be one of the worst mayors that New York City has had in a very long time. But what we're about to get into right here is probably the worst of the worst, okay? Because there was this absolutely tragic fire that took place up in the Bronx just a couple days ago where, about 17 people died, including a bunch of children died in this fire. And, it's an absolute tragedy, but there are people who deserve a lot of blame for this entire situation unfolding. Namely, as we were about to get into, the landlords and the city regulators who failed to make sure that this building was equipped with the necessary fire precautions to save a lot of these people's lives. Now, New York City's mayor, Eric Adams, decided to come out and instead of blaming the landlords or the city regulators and promising to do something about it, he instead chose to blame the actual tenants who ended up dying in this fire. So just absolutely horrific ghoul shit here. Let's just go ahead and listen to his justification for the supposed lesson that is to be learned from this entire tragedy, and then we'll get into more of the details of what actually happened.
And if we take one message from this that Commissioner Nigro has mentioned several times, close the door. Close the door. That was embedded in my head as a child watching the commercials over and over again. We're going to double down on that message. My conversation with the Chancellor this morning, we're going to send out communications to all of our schools and state that we want our children to receive the same level of reinforcement. Muscle memory is everything. And if we can drill that in, we can save lives by closing the doors, not only in the city, but across the entire globe. This painful moment can turn into a purposeful moment as we send the right message of something simple as closing the door.
Okay, so basically what he's talking about here, the closing the door idea, right? He's putting it entirely on the individuals who were, tragically victims of this fire. He's putting it on them for not having the muscle memory to remember to take action and close the doors behind them as they were running away from this fire. Now, first of all, you'll notice some things that he doesn't mention in this, right? He doesn't mention the landlords or the fact that this building had plenty of complaints that were leveled against it by the people who were living in this building. So you see here from Bloomberg, New York City tenants complained of a lack of heat ahead of the deadly fire. So basically what ended up causing this fire, okay, and everybody who ended up dying died due to smoke inhalation. So that's kind of why he was emphasizing the doors need to be closed so that the smoke wouldn't have been able to travel throughout the apartments. But okay, so the tenants that are living here, all right, they had already filed complaints about a lack of heating within this apartment building. And the whole reason why this fire started in the first place was due to a space heater that had caught fire within the apartment building, and that sparked off the entire situation. But the whole reason why people in this building were having to use space heaters in the first place, and this is something that goes for, plenty of different areas around the country, it's not just in the Bronx, but this is something that is happening nationwide, is if you have a building that either the landlord has not equipped it with necessary, insulation, or the ability, or the residents don't have the ability to control the heating within their own apartment, and it's just up to the landlord, well, what the fuck are they supposed to do if they don't have access to reliable quality heating within their apartments? Well, they're going to have to go out, take matters into their own hands, and get a local space heater. Now, those are dangerous to have just sitting around, especially if you aren't, paying attention to them all the time, but that's not the point. The point is that the landlords and the city regulators failed to make sure that the people who were living in this building had actual heat so that they didn't have to go and get space heaters in the first place. But of course, he chooses to blame the tenants for having the space heaters in the first place, and it wasn't even just Mayor Eric Adams here. We also had the actual representative of the local Bronx neighborhood that we're talking about here, Richie Torres. He came out and said basically the same thing. If you close the door, it will prevent the spread of fire. And he also mentioned that, these space heaters are apparently dangerous. Well, again, they wouldn't have to fucking use space heaters if the apartment itself was equipped with adequate heating, okay? And people were complaining of that. And so, you can blame multiple people here, but blaming the tenants is just absolute demon shit. I mean, it's just completely ridiculous. Now, here's where we get to the actual worst part part of all of this, because there is a reason why New York City Mayor Eric Adams is not willing to actually go out there and call out the landlord of this building, and it is because he has a direct connection to the landlord that owns this building. Okay, he was part of his own transition team, so we're going to get into that, but we got a great breakdown here from The Intercept's Natasha Leonard, who gives us a good perspective in terms of how this is not actually about individual responsibility. It's much more so about housing injustice. So here is her piece. I'm just going to read to you guys a little bit of it. The Bronx fire was not only a tragedy, but also a housing injustice. The fire, New York City's deadliest in decades, shows why the pandemic era housing policy band-aids are not enough. So she says the blaze was indeed reportedly sparked by a malfunctioning space heater. This alone was not enough to kill 17 tenants, including 8 children, and leave dozens more hospitalized in critical condition. According to reports, the fire itself was contained to one apartment, and dense black smoke meanwhile spread throughout the entire 19-story building through an apartment door that, were it in line with New York City codes since 2018, should have been self-closing. Okay, so again, these motherfuckers, Richie Torres and Eric Adams, the mayor and the local representative of this area in the Bronx, they're blaming the tenants for not having the muscle memory to close the doors behind them when the doors should have been fucking self-closing according to New York City's own building codes. Okay, so again, you should blame the landlords. You should blame the city regulators who failed to make sure that they were complying with the code enforcement to have those self-closing doors. But of course, they choose to blame the individuals. And again, you're going to see his own, personal connection to that and why he wouldn't be willing to call them out. But they continue here saying that the 1970s building complex, Twin Parks Northwest, has no outdoor fire escapes and a history of management neglect, violations, and complaints, including over a lack of heat and ventilation. And corporate ownership turnover has only compounded the problems. And under normal circumstances, residents said false fire alarms blared so frequently throughout the day that they had become accustomed to ignoring them. So again, talk about muscle memory to remember to close the fucking door behind you. How about the muscle memory of having faulty fire alarms within the building so that the residents that were living here didn't even know if it was a fucking real fire or not? Okay, again, the regulators are to blame here. The landlord is to blame here. But they continue saying that the Bronx fire was not only a tragedy, but also an injustice suffered by predominantly poor, working class African immigrant families living on Section 8 vouchers, a form of government rental assistance for low-income people. And this injustice highlights the need, made ever clearer during the COVID-19 pandemic, to drastically shift power over housing stock away from landlords and investors and into the hands of tenants. So again, you guys know my position on this. I am a socialist. I don't even believe that house should be commodified in the ways that it currently is right now. I believe that housing, along with healthcare and education and a lot of other things, should be considered a human right. So it should not be commodified. We should not have wealthy landowners or landlords that are able to basically completely neglect the actual people who are living in the places while they sit back and collect their checks at the end of the month. So it's just, a completely perverse system to allow the capitalist profit incentive basically to run rampant. And you see exactly what the end result of that is inevitably going to be. You're going to have a bunch of greedy landlords who want to bring in all of this rent and spend absolutely none of it on actually renovating the buildings or making sure that they are up to code. So they continue here saying that we have scant grounds to put faith in the city and state government's promise of safe, permanent places to live for those forced from their homes. And just days ago, the new governor and new mayor, a centrist Democrat and a belligerent former cop, respectively, stood side by side and announced a plan to address homelessness by sending more police to respond to unhoused people taking shelter in the New York subway. Okay, so that's their strategy for addressing homelessness. Again, you see where their priorities are on housing. And this is coming as of right now. We don't know what an update would be on this or if Kathy Hochul is going to change her mind. But as of right now in New York City, I think it's on roughly January 15th, their eviction moratorium is going to be expiring. So not only are they completely neglecting the actual people who are able to afford rent in some of these places and completely neglecting the enforcement of any of these codes to make sure that the buildings are safe, but on top of that, they are going to let the eviction moratorium expire, throwing more people out on the streets while they basically address homelessness by choosing to send more cops to go beat up homeless people in the subways for daring to try to take shelter from the freezing cold outside. So Again, you see how, absolutely ridiculous corporate ghouls these people are, but they say as such they continue a long and violent tradition of criminalizing the poor. And that here's the key part that is really the most, icing on the cake, disgusting part of Eric Adams' role in this, is that Adams, during that press conference, also did not mention that a member of his own transition team for housing issues, Rick Gropper, is the co-founder of Camber Property Group, one of the investors that bought the Bronx building as part of a $166 million 8-building deal in early 2020. And in such profit-driven property relations, affordable housing is treated as an asset and leveraged for access to tax credits. It all but assures that tenants are an afterthought. And she's 100% correct. So again, this motherfucker, Eric Adams, former cop, it's not really surprising that he would have a lot of the views that he, obviously does, with sending cops back into the New York subways to go harass homeless people for trying to stay warm during the winter. But, on every single front that I've seen this man in action, and he's only been in office again for like a couple weeks, okay? And this man is already proving how absolutely horrific he is going to be as a mayor, all right? He's siding with landlords, even ones that directly worked for his own transition team. Think about how corrupt that is, that he would not only, make the comments that he did, but after this tragedy where 17 people, including 8 children, died as a result of this building not being up to code legally within the city of New York, instead of going out there and blaming the actual people who are responsible for this, the city regulators and the landlord, he goes out there, does an entire press conference in the wake of this tragedy, and blames the tenants. And his solution apparently is to educate people, to get the muscle memory to close the door behind them on the way out, when, as we just saw, the codes within New York City showed that it should have been a self-closing door. So it's just completely perverse on so many different levels, and it just drives home the lesson that, above all, the overall lesson in this is that we need to decommodify housing, okay? Get the profit motive out of housing. We can't have landlords that are worth, hundreds of millions of dollars owning especially Section 8 government property, because we know the end result of that, right? We know exactly what they're going to do. They're not going to keep up with the codes. They're not going to keep up with renovations, and they're just going to continue stuffing money into their pockets while the residents and the tenants themselves continue to suffer.